Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all, family, friends, colleagues, to this public defense of Annbjørg Abrahamsen, which is based on her thesis named Fatigue, Sleepiness and Sleep among Faroese Fishers. I will also warmly welcome our international guests, the opponents, Associate Professor Emeritus Jan Riis Jepsen from University of Southern Denmark, and Professor Margareta Lutshøft from Western Norway University of Applied Science. We are very pleased to have you both here on the venue. I am Associate Professor Maria Skålum Pedersen from the University of Faroe Islands, and I am Chair of the Evaluation Committee appointed by the University, and I will chair you through this public defense. The PhD project by Annbjørg Abrahamsen has been conducted at the Department of Occupational Medicine and Public Health, with Professor and Consultant Paul Verja as Principal Supervisor, and Co-Supervisor Wessel von Leuven from Department of Psychology at Stockholm University, and Fróðskaparsetur from Department of Occupational Medicine and Public Health. The PhD candidate has been enrolled at the University of the Faroe Islands. So the program as of today is, the first will the PhD candidate present her dissertation. It will be for 30 minutes. Then we will have questions from the first opponent, which is Jan. Afterwards, there will be a break for 20 minutes. And then the second opponent, Margareta, will continue the examination after the break. If there are people here in the auditorium that want to pose a question or a comment, you could notify me, or you should notify me in the break, and you will have the opportunity to do so after the second opponent. When the examination is over, the evaluation committee will have a short meeting to reach a decision, and afterwards, I, as chair, will announce the conclusion of our final assessment. But before I hand over the floor to the PhD candidate, I will briefly describe why the work of the PhD candidate has been approved for public defense. Annbjørg Abrahamsen has examined the extent, causes, and consequences of fatigue of various fishermen crews across various types of fishing vessels, as well as the crew's amount and sleep of quality and perceived sleepiness during journeys. The thesis consists of 3 articles, which all now have been published in peer-reviewed international journals. The last was published after handing in her thesis. Although fisherman fatigue has been studied before, this study is unique, and to our knowledge, no other studies can be compared to this one. The PhD candidate has convincingly contributed to scientific literature in this field. The extensive collection of data during the field work under supervision of the PhD candidate and the subsequent statistical processing of the impressive amount of data relating to exposures and effects have involved an enormous work task for her. However, the PhD candidate has covered the studied relations in an impressive way. The findings in the thesis are important, and the PhD candidate has convincingly demonstrated that this thesis is suitable for defense. So now I will give the word.
The title of my thesis is, as Maria already has said, Fatigue, Sleepiness and Sleep among Faroese Fishers. And my presentation will be based on the data collected throughout my doctoral studies on board 4 types of Faroese fishing vessels, netting vessels, small trawlers, 2 types of longliners, as well as the observations I made during the trip. It will be presented as it occurs in the 3 scientific articles, which all have been published. Let me first just start by outlining the agenda of the presentation. First, I will provide some background about fatigue, say a few words about the motivation behind this study, and state the overall aims. The findings will be presented as they appear in the article. Following, the overall conclusion will be stated. And last, a few suggestions about preventive perspectives will be put forward. So, fatigue has been found to be the largest single factor contributing to accidents. Seafarers' fatigue is contributing to 16% of all critical vessel accidents and a third of all personal accidents and injuries across all types of maritime operations. A study from New Zealand showed that 23% of the time of days at sea, fishers obtained less than 3 hours of sleep. And also, a study of British fishermen showed that 60% of fishers believed that their health and safety had been at risk due to fatigue. Furthermore, results from other studies at sea have revealed that officers have many sleeps during work when working on the night shift. So, based on this, the motivation was to study workers on Faroese single crew netting vessels, fishing vessels, since fishing is one of the most dangerous occupations there is, with high death rates and injury rates, and with Faroese fishers having 4 times more accident rates than fishers on land. Therefore, we wanted to study the consequences of fatigue when working prolonged hours to improve the safety and health of workers in this high-risk occupation. So why study fatigue in fishers? We know that the factors that are... We know that the factors that are listed here are considered normal within the seafarer's occupation, like long working days, disturbed sleep rhythms, rough working environment, roll and vibration, physical work, noise, and more. All of these have usually been associated with increasing fatigue, and thus the likelihood for fatigue is very high, and probably higher than in most occupations. Therefore, the aims were to investigate the fisher's sleep and sleepiness and compare the different vessel types and to determine the explanatory factors. To understand how and to what degree fatigue influences the cognitive performance of these crews, and to gain a broader understanding of how each of the various factors of the fisher's working environment contributed to their fatigue. So how did we do this? Methods and materials for the data. It was decided that we wanted to cover an as broad description of the fisher's working environment as possible. And it soon became clear that this would be difficult without me attending the trips, as the fishers would already have had time for resting for many hours before reaching the harbor. Thus, it was decided that I would attend all their trips, and in this way I could also make sure that the procedures were as similar as possible. The data was collected from 18 trips over a 15-month period, a period that was reasonably low workload and income, where one of the trips actually was terminated due to that fishing could not cover the expenses. The fishers were assessed with a large questionnaire at the beginning of the trip, accessing the various psychometric scales, collecting data about demographics and work history, as well as a short questionnaire about their current trip was used at the end of the trip. Sleep periods, sleepiness, and physical fatigue were registered throughout the trip, as well as fishers were given an actigraphy, a watch-like device recording movements, that were used to indicate the difference between wake and sleep periods. The fisher's cognitive performance was tested on a computer at the beginning and end of the test of the trip, as well as after last work of shift. And for the environmental variables, a noise dosimeter was used to measure noise exposure, and shift movements were measured with a gyroscope positioned approximately in the middle of the ship on the bridge. Being present on board further made it possible for me to make some personal observations. Altogether, the test period took The testing took about 3 to 4 hours, as well as registration throughout the trip. Here we have on the rows we have the names of the vessel groups, and in the columns we see various information about like the length of the trips, the crew size, and the total number of days of data within each vessel group, as well as the total. And here we see some details and composition of the crew and how they are divided into the 4 vessel groups. We have 90 fishers with longliners without freezing facilities, 14 from longliners with freezing facilities, 34 from netting vessels, and 19 from trawlers. Of these, the majority of the participants were deckhands, 81, and the rest were fairly evenly distributed among the other occupational groups. The mean age of the fishers was 41.1, with the trawler crew being the oldest and the freezer longliners the youngest. All the vessel groups had a mean BMI higher than 25, with an overall mean of 26.7. The fishers' mean working experience in year was 19.5, with the least experience less than 1 year, and the most experienced 53 years as a fisher. The mean work days per fisher in the participating study was 196. Okay, Article 1. The aim of Article 1 was to investigate sleep and sleepiness among fishers in these 4 vessel groups, and sleep at sea was compared to sleep at home. The data was collected from the same 157 fishers throughout all the 3 articles. For this first article, actigraphy and sleep diaries were used at sea and on land, and Karlinska's sleepiness scale and the physical fatigue scale were used at sea throughout the trip. Here we see some results gained from the actigraphs comparing sleep at sea to sleep at home, with blue for at sea and red for at home. And we can see that fishers had more sleep periods per day at sea. They slept less per day in minutes at sea and had shorter sleep durations at sea in minutes. All of these were highly significant. Furthermore, we saw that there was a high variation between the vessel groups at sea, but not at home. Sleep efficiency and sleep latency are highly influenced by location, whether they are at sea or at home. Again, blue is for sea and red is for land. Sleep efficiency is the percentage of time spent in bed when trying to sleep that they actually sleep. Overall, the sleep efficiency was quite low, 65.4 at sea and 83.3 on land. Sleep efficiency should preferably be above 85 in healthy sleep. Furthermore, the sleep latency is the time in minutes it takes a person to fall asleep after turning out the lights. It was found that also the sleep latency was low, both for at sea and on land. It is quite convenient to fall fast asleep when on the clock, and it's not unlikely that we got a natural selection of individuals here that sleep easily among this occupational group, but it can also be an indication of a sleep-deprived population if people consistently spend under 8 minutes to fall asleep. So now to the subjective ratings. More than 6,000 sleep registrations were registered throughout the trip. The fishers were instructed to register their sleep on a scale from 1 to 9, at least every second hour, while awake. A score of 7 or higher is defined as severe sleepiness and has been associated with increased risk of accidents. Despite working 24/7, and some start their working day midnight, we see that their sleep, spread over the 24 hours, follows the typical rhythm of workers on land, where they are most tired during the evening and night, and report lower levels of sleepiness during the day, which also suggests that they are still controlled by their biological rhythms, even though work and sleep in different times. From a paired sample t-test comparing the Karolinska sleepiness scores at the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip, dividing into vessel groups, a very high increase was measured in sleepiness at the end of the trip, from 3.5 to 5.8. Fishers with trawlers and longliners were the most tired at the beginning of the trip, while the group scored quite similar at the end of the trip. The difference was highly significant for everyone but the trawler crew. Furthermore, when looking at the vessel group separately and how their scores are spread over the scale, we see that netting vessels, who have the highest work-rest ratio, working approximately 16 hours and having 8 hours off, spend the most time in the severe sleepiness zone, followed by trawlers, who had the most time off, but with their rest period split into 3 to 4 short periods per day. Freezer longliners who work 8/8 and had the longest trip spent the least time in this high accident risk zone. And now we're going to Article 2, which focuses on how fishers work in environmental variables such as roll and noise, time of day, catch of weight, and more affects their fisher. Herein we were specifically focusing on sleep efficiency as an outcome variable of how their sleep is influenced, as well as on subjective sleepiness and physical fatigue as outcome variables. The participants in this study were the same, but one netting vessel was excluded from this analysis as they differ too much from the rest of the vessel groups, disturbing the overall analysis. To this study, ship noise and movement were measured, as well as sleep periods, sleepiness, and physical fatigue diaries were used, and questionnaires as well. We found that already at the beginning of the trip, the multidimensional fatigue inventory 20, which examines 5 dimensions of fatigue, general, physical, and mental fatigue, reduced activity, and reduced motivation, was used to examine their subjective fatigue. The questionnaire showed that all vessel groups scored highest on general fatigue, 12, which also is higher than the general Danish population, as well as a study of Danish fishers. And furthermore, from the following paper, it was found that fishers with a paid job on land between trips also scored higher compared to the rest of the fishers. In the analysis of which variables of their working day had the largest effect on the outcome variables, which again were sleep efficiency, sleepiness, and physical fatigue, time of day was the variable with the highest effect, and with sleep efficiency being highest when sleeping during the night and worst when sleeping between 6 a.m. to 12:30 and between 18:30 to midnight. This suggests that it is our physiological limitations with an inner biological clock in not being made for staying awake during the night and sleep during the day that is our largest opponent regarding safety. This is especially true for the task on the bridge, where officers usually sit in darkness and without physical activity. This is also thought to be the reason for why the majority of accidents and collisions and groundings happen between midnight and 6 a.m. Hereafter, roll to the side and pitch fore and aft were the variables who had the second largest effect on their sleep efficiency, with sleep efficiency reducing with higher roll and pitch, indicating that Fishers sleep worse in more ship movement. Engine power and catch per person per day both had a positive effect on the sleep efficiency, meaning that as these increase, so did the sleep efficiency. I can't find it. Yeah. If you see this one here, this picture shows the roll measurement. This is taken on a day with mirror clear seas, but on the same trip we had also measures of 59 degrees of roll to the side. 59 was the highest that this measurement the equipment could measure. Last of the objective measures, an interaction was seen between the number of days at sea and the numbers of sleep per day, and how they affected the Fishers' sleep efficiency. We found that the further into the trip, the sleep efficiency of Fishers sleeping 2 or less than 2 sleep periods per day increased, while sleep efficiency decreased for those who slept more than 2 sleep periods per day. From the analysis examining the impact of environmental variables on the Fishers' physical fatigue, the time of day again had the strongest effect, as it was found that Fishers were least tired between 6:30 and 12:30, and again between 12:30 and 18:30, compared to at midnight to 6:30. Increases in roll and pitch also had, as expected, a positive relationship with physical fatigue, confirming that ship movement increases physical fatigue. Lastly, the number of days at sea was negatively correlated with physical fatigue, with fatigue decreasing slightly with more days at sea. On the other hand, sleepiness increased slightly with each additional day at sea. No other environmental variable showed to have an effect on sleepiness when in a model with other variables, but the time of day showed to have a significant effect on sleepiness when alone in the model, with Fisher scoring significantly lower in the 3 time blocks between 6:30 to midnight than between midnight to 6:30. And then to Article 3. Our primary aim of Article 3 about cognitive fatigue was to study how fatigue influences the cognitive functions, and whether changes could be in cognitive performance could be observed during the Fishers' time at sea. The Fishers were tested on 5 subtests at the beginning and end of the trips, as we can see here: simple reaction time, numeric working memory, course block, digit vigilance, and card sorting. These tests were chosen based on that they are a measure of mental efficiency, which has been shown to be sensitive to fatigue. Test results gave an objective measure of the Fishers' ability and made it possible to view the changes in their cognitive performances. Based on a test-retest design, results from the end of the trip were compared to those at the beginning. From a paired t-test between the course block tests conducted at the beginning and end of the trip, we can see that there is a significant reduction in their memory, short-term visual-spatial memory, at the end of the trip. And the simple reaction time test also revealed a significant decrease in attention with more major lapses, which is reaction times higher than 1,000 milliseconds at the end of the trip. In addition to test time, beginning and end of the trip, having a huge influence on most of all of the outcome on the tests, age also consistently had an impact on the results on the digit vigilance and simple reaction time tests. While job type and trip length, together with vessel, were found to have additional influence on some of the variables measured. Here we see changes from first to second half on the digit vigilance test, which assesses attention and vigilance. Research has shown that most people can perform at optimal level for a little while, but when the test becomes one of endurance, fatigue manifests. Therefore, the decision was taken to divide the test variables of the DV test and simple reaction time test, digit vigilance test and simple reaction time test, into two halves to see if changes were observed. The findings showed an increase in all of the variables of the digit vigilance test in the second half of the 3 minutes test, as you can see here. This also indicates that our hypothesis that fishers were rested at the beginning of the trip probably was wrong, and they most likely, more or less, are chronically fatigued. Although on the previous slide, when comparing the end of the trip to the beginning on the simple reaction time test, we saw that fishers had more lapses at the end of the trip. When dividing this test into two halves and calculating mean lapses per half, on both occasions they had more major lapses in the first half of the test. This is most likely due to that this was the first test in the test sequence, and the fishers might have used a few responses to get acquainted to the test situation. We also found that at the beginning of the trip, fishers had higher standard deviation at the second half of the test, which tells us that there in general has been a bigger variation in the responses in the second half of the test, with high variance in responses also being an indication of fatigue, as our responses tend to become less predictable and more varied when tired. Reaction times are shown to be dependent on person types. Morning and evening persons also know, or AM. Morning persons known going to bed early and getting up early, and evening persons, which is the preference for staying up late and sleeping in, were compared on their reaction times at the beginning and end of the trip. And this analysis was conducted since research has shown that morning types have more difficult with adapting with working in shifts. On the graph, we see reaction times in milliseconds on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, morning and day, evening and night. Blue lines are represented for morning types, red for evening types, and green is for the in-between. From the figure at the beginning of the trip, we see that we can see that the morning types score better in the morning, while the evening types score better in the evening. However, at the end of the trip, we can see that this pattern has disappeared, but we can see that there's a clear difference between the morning, evening, and in-between types, with the evening types coping significantly better with working in shifts. So, to the overall conclusions. Fishers sleep better and longer on shore. The fishers report higher sleepiness at the end of the trip. and highly significant differences were observed between vessel groups with regard to time spent in the severe sleepiness zone, with those with the highest work-rest ratio were being those who have spent most time in the severe sleepiness zone, 7 or higher, which also has been known to increase the risk of accidents. The Fishers demonstrated high general fatigue at the beginning of a trip, and time of day was the highest influence on the Fishers' sleep and fatigue. Ship movement decreases sleep efficiency and also increases physical fatigue. The catch was positively associated with their sleep efficiency. Fishers slept better with high catch, but no relationship was found to sleepiness and physical fatigue. This could be maybe a hunter's high. Fishers sleep better on ships with larger engines, and we found that splitting sleep into more than 2 sleep periods per day decreased the sleep efficiency over time. Noise did not seem to contribute to the Fishers' fatigue, and the Fisher demonstrated declines in cognitive functions in terms of increased occurrence of reaction times higher than 1,000 milliseconds and reduced visuospatial short-term memory. The Fishers also seem to be a chronically fatigued population, with performance on cognitive tests decreasing during the 3 minutes assessment. Last types of person influences the Fisher's sensitivity to shift work. Evening persons seemed to adapt better to shift work and demonstrated lower reaction times. Given the answers gained through this research, it could benefit the health and safety of workers and possibly also the productivity, that ship owners and the workers' union would focus on improving the Fishers' opportunity for rest. It will be a good investment to install stabilators and construct vessels to reduce ship movement, with ship movement having the largest impact on fatigue. The implementation of fatigue risk management systems could help to predict and identify the fatigue levels on board, as well as raise awareness regarding the risk fatigue induces. It might also be beneficial to let the Fishers choose which chronotypes to work on, which shifts to work on, depending on their chronotypes. And we can conclude that the safety of the vessels and their crew could benefit from the work environment being designed according to the human physiological requirements and its limitations. I would like to say thank you to everyone who's come to listen, to the supervisors, to the dissertation committee, other collaborators, family and friends, and the Department of Occupational and Medicine and Public Health, my colleagues there, and in particular to the Fishers who participated, and my partner Jonas, who has supported and tolerated my absent-mindedness due to this project, and not to forget the funders, without whom this project would not have seen the day. And last, I would like to send a happy birthday to my father, who is watching from Malaysia today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annbjørg, and thank you for inviting me to the Faroe Islands. I've been here 3 times before, enjoyed every time. First time was research, second time was jazz music, and now third time is research again. So I'm impressed by the activity, the research activity that you have here in the Faroe Islands. And this thesis is a very good example of that. I think that it's the biggest field study ever made among fishermen. At least I haven't found anything comparable. And looking at this study, when I was reading it, it was very difficult. It might be in spite of my age. It was definitely not because of bad writing, because it's well written, but it's complicated because there's so many variables. And it's really hard to find track, at least for me. The field study, I think, is very important for this study, and I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit about how was it to be on board fishing ships almost an entire year.
Yeah.
One woman in a male society, and having dealt your life with the fishermen, eating, sleeping, everything was together with them. So you have had very close contact. I also believe that your discussions with the fishermen could probably lead to some suggestions, ideas about how to make things better. Like, so you could say this is a participatory approach to research, or could be included. So please elaborate a little bit on how you felt and how you were received by the fishermen.
Well, I was prepared to meet a bit of resistance, that academics would come on board. But I was positively surprised. They welcomed me very well. There was someone who said, "Oh, females are not supposed to be on board of a ship," but that happened I think at the end of the trip, I knew all of his life stories. So it was very nice, but it required something different than working in the office. I didn't have my own office, and sometimes the living conditions were just a curtain. And I was told that, I was told that don't expect that you're allowed to shower every day and use all the water. We don't want to go in because we need water. So there were a few things, but they were very welcoming, and it was very interesting. And I think the study would not have been the same without actually having participated, because I could understand the work processes, and I even tried some of the things, and so things made better sense, and also being able to observe their little community. They had their own community, I think was quite giving. And also, I mean, I was measuring fatigue on questionnaires, but being on board actually made one be able to observe that they were very talkative in the beginning, very tired in the end, and the difference between the shifts, like the 6-6ers eat and sleep, while the 8-8ers seemed more social, and you get insight into a few variables that you otherwise would not get insight to. So it was really nice.
Did you feel fatigue?
I think so. I was normally very tired when getting back off the ship, even though I did not do the same things as they did. Of course, in the beginning, I also had some seasickness, but that went over reasonably quickly.
Fortunately, what would have happened if you felt seasickness all through the...
It would have made my study a bit...
You couldn't do it, I think.
I mean, I have been working on ferries before, so I was trained to it, but luckily I'm one of those who I throw up and then I'm good again.
Yeah, that's good.
So I guess I could, but it would have been a bit more exhausting if I had to throw up 202 days during my data collection. So, but I got used to it reasonably quickly.
Was it difficult to persuade the fishermen to report and report and report?
The participation rate was actually quite high.
Yes,
I don't think it would not have been possible if it was not on board on the ship. And some said no in the beginning, but then they participated anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's boring in their time off. But no, it was not too difficult. And sometimes I promised them I would bake them pancakes. That also helped a bit to the relation.
So you did do that?
Yes.
You made pancakes?
On the first trip, I learned that pancakes are not supposed to be made in all kinds of weather. So I had to clean the kitchen as well. But so it took some time to actually get my mindset into actually being on a moving platform.
Of course.
Yeah.
What about, how did you sleep? How were the bed facilities and cabin facilities?
They were very varying between vessels. Some beds were really bad, others were okay. I noticed that one ship had feathers in the mattresses. That's not very smart. Or I didn't think that was very smart when in bad weather.
I saw one study from Cardiff, and they were looking very deeply into the quality of beds and found it to be very important indeed. And I think that's probably one of the things that can be made better easily.
Yeah.
And so just not to forget, my suggestion is that you have collected all these data, and some of them you haven't used, and other data you have in your head, you haven't collected them systematically, but you have a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
This can be used for further publications, and I think it should be, because you have this knowledge that nobody else has.
Yeah, that's kind of the feeling I'm with. I spent quite a while on collecting this data, but after having finished this work, I feel I've only scraped the surface because there's so much data left that could be used and be divided further into. But definitely mattresses is a very simple thing, and I know the Icelandic made a study where they systematically gave half of the crew new mattresses, and just by replacing mattresses, they slept, I think it was 33 or 36 minutes extra on a 6-hour shift.
Yeah.
So
Good.
Yeah.
Now, we know that there's so many risk factors for fatigue, and so many consequences of fatigue. For the risk factors, you have dealt with some of them. There are others. And for the consequences, you've mainly focused on accidents, which is important. And you say you have 4 times more accidents in Faroese fishing vessels than on land.
Yeah.
I think with the current culture in fishing in Denmark, these numbers are about the same. So it's really improving in Denmark.
I think actually what I read was that in Denmark the fishers were better off than workers on land. So it cannot be used as an excuse that it's because it's a moving platform.
I think one of the reasons will be the culture aspect, and that especially the young fishermen, when they are trained to become fishermen, are really trained also in safety and trained in health. So there's something that could also be introduced, or maybe, introduced, it's here, but it could be probably improved.
Yeah.
Now I'll turn to something else, namely the sampling of the participants. Because there were these 157 participants in a number of vessels, and I believe when you sampled the people, you started on with sampling the vessels.
The vessels,
is that right?
Vessel types and
yes. So could that cause a selection bias?
Yes, it could. It's likely that. I mean, there was only one vessel where for example, in one group. There's only one vessel that I did not participate. There could have been some differences on board on that one, but I also knew, for example, during some April, May, in one group, I could not participate on the vessels because there's one thing that Paris know, that the e-banking, it's a fishing bank that opens and then there's a lot of fish, and they normally. Sometimes the longest of these took 9 days to fill up. But during that period, they would fish for 48 hours work from leaving the harbor in, out again. so that would have demonstrated much more fatigue, but I couldn't get on these trips due to that they needed the extra bed.
Yeah, of course, this is difficult.
So it's difficult, but otherwise I think everyone allowed me to participate on board. But sometimes it was logistics that made it not possible.
I would say that probably the vessels participating would have better environmental climate than those who did not participate. Well, I don't know if this is true, but this is
it could
likely.
be. I could not. Some of the vessels that did not participate, I had conversation with them, and it was the plan to actually get on board, but it was more logistics that made it not possible.
Okay.
So we had, out of the vessel groups that we were investigating, we were on board on 16 vessels out of 25. So, but yeah, it's possible.
So it's possible, but it's not very likely. And I think if there is a bias there, it would probably show that you have found the best.
Yeah. And actually, it should probably be.
It's probably worse in reality than what you found. Yeah.
And it should probably be underlined that during this data collection period, it was a period with very little fish, so it was kind of lower work exposure than sometimes.
Yes.
I mean, there were also one trip that was terminated due to they couldn't fish for the oil.
Yeah.
So the work exposure has been at the minimum, so everything is could be considered to be worse. Yeah.
Before completing the cognitive test, the fishermen provided details about their activities during the previous 24 hours, like sleep, food, alcohol, cigarettes, and so you have this information.
I have this information.
Would that likely influence results if you include some of them?
In the preliminary analysis, I did not see any of those influence anything.
No. Oh, so you actually looked for it?
I had a look at it, but I think I would like to do a multivariate analysis, seeing how the additional variables, what the effect will be of that one, because research has shown from other studies that
but of course
that it is the sum of the risks that is the most important.
You can still do it if you find it useful. Yeah. You have provided reference illustrating validity aspects for KSS, but not for the other rating scales. You didn't find any, or you didn't look for them, or I know it's difficult to validate
I think
rating
actually
scales.
it was might have been a wrong choice, but it was cut out for word count, because in earlier versions I actually had it in. So I thought, okay, because I had the references, and in the references one could see the validity.
And these rating scales are standard, I think.
Yeah, they are quite standard. They've been used in a lot of studies.
I know. You mentioned, and that surprised me a little bit. You mentioned that the cognitive tests are objective tests. Objective tests.
Oh, I was talking about the cognitive computerized tests.
Yes, the computerized.
Yeah.
But I mean, making them computerized doesn't make them more objective, does it? I mean, if you can still provide. The fisherman can still put data in the computer that is not real. I mean, it's not really objective, is it?
No, of course it's a little bit, but I would expect them, they could have an agenda wanting to produce a certain result.
They could, yeah.
But I expected that they would behave in a similar way on both occasions. That was kind of, but I can't rule out that they might have an agenda.
You're probably right, because these people are your friends, and they wanted to help you, and they wanted to have some results that could be helpful to themselves. Yes, I think you're right. But I was just wondering how can it be objective?
Yeah, you're right. It cannot be truly objective. There is the risk of that. But it was my experience that they were quite happy that someone bothered to
Exactly.
look at their well-being and health, and they were quite willing to participate and do their best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You presented 2 of the cognitive tests,
Yeah.
and some of the others were not changing from between the 2 test points. Why could that be, you think?
I think these are probably the ones that are most sensitive to fatigue, because they're the simplest ones.
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the main reasons. Yeah, okay, the Corsa block also, is the third one that they also
But there could be many reasons. Also, what I was thinking about is that the study subjects were fatigued already at the beginning of so maybe the difference was too small for.
It was much smaller than expected.
Yeah.
But when I was comparing to other studies, like of pretty representable for the general population, even though there's a very small change from the beginning to the end of the Fisher studies, their scores are significantly higher than other general populations. So that kind of a little bit underlines that it's very important to have a control group somewhere, because if you just compare, if everyone are fatigued, you won't really get anything, because the change is that smaller.
Yeah.
So.
I was thinking about the perspectives of generalizing from this study to global fisheries.
Yeah.
I think that there would be other parts of the world where you have a similar fishing fleet.
Yeah.
And for example, coastal fishing is completely different.
Yeah, shorter trips and
so
fewer.
have you thought about these things?
Yeah, I think if comparing to other fleets, I would mostly say deep sea fishers, like in Iceland, like the commercial large vessel. In Norway also they are similar. But it can always become a problem too when comparing between. But I guess, as I know of the Icelandic fleet and the Norwegian fleet, fishing fleet,
they're comparable.
Are reasonably comparable if we're within the same category, because that was also one of the problems, or not problems, but
challenges.
When I had, for example, type of shift didn't show significant, even though we could see there were differences. But normally the same type of ship was within a single category. So we're not only studying type of ships, but the other things as well. So if comparing to the same category of vessels, I think it could be reasonably comparable.
And the standard of ships in the various ships are comparable to those in Norway or Iceland?
Ours are probably older. It was quite an old fleet. We had like the longliners without freezing facilities. I think the mean age was 54. It has been replaced quite much since then. So maybe I kind of put my eggs in the wrong basket, I can say, because now my largest group was longliners without freezing facilities, and now they've changed to mostly being longliners with freezing facilities. And so this fleet is a little bit younger. So hopefully, if we're thinking about the ergonomics, the newer ships are expected to be better.
Yes, and maybe they're being replaced in the coming years with newer ships. One thing that I wondered about, the fishermen's mean BMI was 26.7.
Yeah.
And this is overweight.
That's quite high, yeah.
And furthermore, a proportion of them reported chronic health problems. And still they believed, or they rated themselves as healthy.
Yeah.
So that's a bit surprising. It's very optimistic, and of course it also tells something about the fishermen, maybe the macho culture or whatever, I don't know. but really they're not too healthy, are they? And they're chronically fatigued as well.
Yeah, they're chronically fatigued. They probably don't know about that because they've been in that situation for so long.
It's normal for them.
Yeah, it's their normal. And I think that could also be the reason for rating oneself healthy, even though you have high blood pressure and cholesterol and these things. Because
and they do have it. They have all these things.
Yeah, they do have all these things, but I do understand that if you are on medicine, you're dependent on that medicine to keep you healthy, and you think you feel okay. But I know in our fourth paper that we were looking at, actually, if you consider yourself having a condition that needs treatment, that is the strongest factor actually to predict how they are influenced by fatigue.
Yeah.
So it does influence, but they don't perceive as it does. But regarding the BMI, I think it's a bit unfair to use BMI on fishers, because I know just if I'm comparing, I and the fisher were on these scales that measures these fancy ones that measure muscle mass and fat and everything.
Yeah.
My fat ratio was higher than the other person's, but my BMI was lower because his muscle mass was higher. So,
so
it's a kind of BMI is probably not the best.
No, it's not a good
indication,
parameter.
but
it's an indicator, but not the best one.
Not for this group, because they are quite high on muscle.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But how do you expect their health to develop over time? They're still chronically fatigued.
Yeah.
And
how I am expecting their health.
How would it develop? I think if you look at the elderly fishermen comparing with the younger, you'll see naturally a decline in health parameters.
There is a decline in health, and I could also see that fishers over 50, painkillers were a very...
They used it.
They were, they had the hips and the shoulders, and they had muscle pain. And,
they're hardworking.
And from another research that I did before this one, where we looked at the age of fishermen, it's heavily declining after 50 because they're already worn down.
Exactly.
So the work is kind of too demanding for most to stay until they reach their end of work age. Yeah.
In this part of the world, the summers are day all night, and the winter is night all day.
Yeah.
So, what's the impact of that, or what could be the impact? I have no idea.
I think, I mean, they are, at least some of them, they are working under deck all the time, and as well as the light is the biggest external variable to influence their diurnal rhythm. So it's my thought that actually having grown up in a place where summer and winter vary very much, maybe gives you a more flexible rhythm. Just a thought, but it also can be an extra challenge if that's not the case. An extra challenge on their sleep patterns.
Probably. Did you experience? You were there winter as well as summer.
Yeah.
Was there any difference from your perspective?
There was. People were lighter in summer. Yeah. But I think, but it might not only be due to light. It might also be. I mean, in the winter there is more ship movement also because there are more storms.
Yes. Yes, that can complicate.
So it's So that is kind of the bad thing about not having a field study, that you cannot control for other unwanted variables. But winter is. They're in darkness all of the time, and in summer they're also half time in the darkness. So they probably don't build up the same D-vitamin depots as the rest. So yeah, that could probably have long-term health effects as well.
When we are talking about prevention, we want to identify causal factors. And identifying causal factors is actually not, at least it's not possible when you make cross-sectional design, like in this study. Yeah. But still you have the differences between land and sea, and so of course you have identified some risk factors, even if it's not scientifically
it's not
completely 100%. So what should be the priorities in when you're talking about prevention? There are so many. You mentioned some of them, and I think you should not only prevent accidents but also prevent health issues.
Yeah.
And so there are so many things, but I think it actually boils down to something very basic, that I understand the economy of the fishing vessels and the fishing industry is quite good. So do you really need a single cruise, or could you consider double cruise, or could there be shorter trips, or this sort of things?
Well, that is the thing. This fleet that I was testing was not the one with the highest economy. So that's also the reason why the vessels were quite old, and that's also the reason why, they're probably the most exposed, because some of them I experienced never had a trip off. They only had time off between trips, which could be seldom. Yeah. And still someone who had been working, I think it was 280 days in a year, he said that his income had only been 15,000 kroner higher than someone working in a fish factory, 8 to 4.
Yeah, that's
so it really depends on. Right now the economy is good, the prices are good, but at that point, oil was expensive. There was not very much fish, and prices were low.
So it's changing a lot.
So we can't really look at all categories in the similar way, and that's probably also why some of the things were not, very, very outdated. I know this ship has been exchanged with a newer one, but one of the fishers told me that when he entered the ship in 2007, he had exchanged a mattress with grass in it.
Oh.
for a normal one, in 2007.
Yeah.
But because it was one of the older cruise ships, it also means that they had more beds. So it could have been a bedroom that hasn't been used for a while, and that's the reason why. But having grass mattresses in 2007 is quite bad. Yeah.
Thank you, Annbjørg. I think
Thank you.
I will leave you there, and there will be coffee break. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now there are 20 minutes break. There's coffee outside.
Så, ja. Yeah. Oh, that's loud. I won't get too close to you. Really.
Sådan?
Sådan.
Ja.
Annbjørg, it's over soon. I am literally between you and the alcohol.
Huh? Oh, exactly.
And we should just have a nice conversation to finish the week and finish your work.
Yes.
I wanted to tell a little story about the thing you said with all the fresh water. Women shouldn't be at sea because they use up all the fresh water. And I have a colleague who is a chief engineer, a female, and she decided once she would check this. So she measured the use of fresh water before a woman came on board and after. And it turns out that it's before she comes. All the men use all the fresh water because they want to look nice. So it's not our fault.
No. And I cut my hair for it.
So the first comment is I can see a progression through your work, which is always a positive thing. I like to see, and because sometimes you feel that your first paper wasn't very good and you'd never want someone to see it again. Mm-hmm. But I like seeing that you get better and better.
Thank you.
So what is this a Ph.D. in? It could be a Ph.D. in many things.
Yes, it's quite broad, but mainly it's a Ph.D. in fatigue, or we try to focus about the fatigue because the fatigue is, is a result of, but it could also be a PhD in sleep. I mean, but fatigue is kind of a consequences of,
yes.
And it could also be in health, and it could also be, but our main was to document fatigue through the cognitive measures, but we also saw that, we had also measures. Other measures as well that documented it just as well or better.
So how did you choose the journals you published in?
The first one, because it was about sleep and looked a little bit about impact factors. But then I thought, even though the impact factor on the International Maritime Health Journal is not that high, that is the public, the people I want to reach. So therefore, I choose them to actually reach the right readers.
I agree, and this feeds into the next question, because when you're doing your research, you have a hidden or maybe an open objective, and there could be one of three things. You could want to change the world. Or everyone goes in, I'm going to change the world. It could be just bringing new knowledge to the world, or something you feel towards the end is just to get a PhD. Which one applies most to you?
Well, it wasn't the third one. I just, I hope to get a PhD now, but it was a little bit to change the world through knowledge, really.
So I guess the answer is always all three.
Yeah.
Depending on where you are.
So I'm happy to get the PhD.
There are a number of concepts with which we judge the quality of research. They could be validity, reliability, and objectivity. They are most commonly used in quantitative research. But sometimes they, rightly or wrongly, are applied in qualitative or field research. I just wanted to ask you a few questions, because if you define validity, it's basically about finding the truth, if you believe that science can find the truth. So internal validity is about ruling out other factors' effect outside the ones you were actually studying. Do you have any thoughts about that in your study? Because all the factors...
Yeah, there are so many factors, so that is probably a bit difficult to say exactly which ones are causing what, or what are the covariates that produce the changes. But I think it is a payoff of what you want to see, and if we would have done it in a laboratory, it would have reached higher internal validity. But it might not reflect the real world that we were actually trying to look into. So, I think it's a payoff that was worth it.
It is, and it's one of the longest and most impressive field studies I've seen as well. I did some together with one of your supervisors, field studies many years ago.
Yeah.
And we were impressed with ourselves at that time, but this is, well, he wasn't. But I think this is really impressive. And I did discuss a little bit with Jørgen the effect of you being on board.
Yeah.
What do you think? Could that have a positive or negative effect on the reactions and the willingness to participate?
It could have both. I think it might have more a positive effect when the researchers on board. And I really doubt that they would have filled in their questionnaires and continue with their diaries as consistently if I was not on board. And I also, because I had the opportunity to remind them, have you remembered to fill in your questionnaire? And some stopped halfway through because it was a very long questionnaire. Yeah. So I would encourage them to continue and be their secretary if that would make the difference. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think I also think it's from a health perspective, it's healthy to have a female on board because it's a very male-dominated community, and you don't talk about feelings or how you feel or about your worries with your co-workers, but it's okay to talk to me about it. So I guess at the end of the trip, sometimes I knew more about some of these crews, of these men, than their co-workers who had known them for 20 years, because they share different information when it's a female. Yeah. And I think that would happen even if I was not a psychologist, just that there is a woman on board.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had, and you also made pancakes. And you also made pancakes.
And I made pancakes, yeah.
You've already talked about the external validity, the generalization. But reliability is about getting the same answer every time you measure. You could say it's about consistency.
Yeah.
Do you think you would get the same results if you did it again?
Similar. I think I would get similar because, but there are... there was one shift that I attended 3 times. Approximately the same crew, some were changing. But it was also it was 3 different work exposures, one could say. So one was outside Faroese waters, Greenlandic waters. It was actually the trip with the highest catch per man. So there was one rhythm, and then there were 2 different locations and organizing work a bit differently. So there are a few factors that variate, but overall they had the same work system and they had the same work tasks. But there are always some variables that will change, and even season has a big difference. So.
Yeah, and as Jørgen said, the time of year and the You mentioned that you got written consent.
Yeah.
In Norway, we call it informed consent. I'm not sure that's the same. Could you tell me a little bit about the ethics procedure here and the protection of personal data?
Yeah. Before conducted data, I designed my questionnaire, and this was sent to the data protection and ethics committees, and these were accepted. And then before participating, Gulf Fishers were informed about what the study was about, how the data was going to be used, and to make sure that everything was okay. Yeah.
So you're basically promising anonymity.
Yes. Yeah.
But there was one woman in the study.
Yeah.
I know you didn't split the data analysis because that would have been useless, of course. But is it possible that just saying there was one woman, everybody knows who it was?
It is possible. Yeah, very possible. At the time, at least, she's not at sea anymore. But yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of
it's
like,
a
yeah.
trade-off.
But I never analyzed her results separately. So yeah.
So there is a move towards more of open science and sharing. Is there any data you think could be shared from your study and used by someone else?
Yes, I mean, the smallest part has been done, or I mean, the data collection is a big part, but I kind of feel that I could, even though I finished my Ph.D. study now, I've only done the surface. Like, you could do a whole Ph.D. on sleep alone. You could do a whole PhD on noise measures.
Using the data that you already have.
Yeah, that I already have, and go deeper into that one, go deeper into the noise data, shift movement, and also the questionnaires. There are a lot of questionnaires that were not used because they had so many other variables. Yeah.
I have a few technical questions about what language did you use when you were collecting the data?
Faroese.
And who did the translation of that was needed?
Yeah, I did the translations. Yeah.
Could you see any problem with that, or a benefit maybe?
Problems and benefits. I know you're supposed to translate back and forward, which ideally, but need to have someone to do that. And but having me doing it, it's I know what I'm trying to communicate, and I think my English is fairly good, so I know. So if I would have someone else translate, they might not read the same message out of the question. So I hope that it's I think it's has not made the research worse having me translating it.
No, it's just something you need to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
You used a couple of different Likert scales.
Yeah.
One was 5 points for the sleep quality, and the other was 6 points for the Karolinska sleep questionnaire. Do you have any thoughts on differences between a 5 and a 6 point scale?
A 5 point scale you can always cross the middle.
Yes.
So
it's the Scandinavian way. Go the middle. Mellanmjölk. Yeah.
So I prefer the 6 point scale.
Because you force them to choose. Yeah. The actigraph, and this is a question we have had unanswered for some time, I believe. Is it affected by ship movement? Is there a risk that the ship movement could have an impact on your measurement?
Yes, I think so. Exactly how much I would like to dig deeper into, but when there's more shift movement, I'm wondering if this. I was also thinking that if the low sleep was partly due to the active watchers being influenced by the ship movement. But at the same time, I think if the ship movement is that much, it will also influence the fishers who are wearing it. But it might influence more, and it would be, since we have an active watch that has three angles, then one could go into the active watch data to further control and analyze. But we did not go.
No, that's a possible study.
It is a possible study for someone else, and it is one that I think ought to be done. Yeah.
Now, I've met an Australian researcher at a conference, and he said, if I believe I remember correctly, he said something that the only time he saw an effect was on a fishing boat.
Okay.
So that could be an interesting study to check.
Yeah.
I mean, to do, because I don't believe he's published that.
Okay, yeah.
PVT testing, we had a problem with that in our studies, because if you do it too long, as long as you do to get really good results, people get tired and bored. And then you have to reduce them, and then you don't get the measurement. How did you decide where to put the cutoff?
We were trying to think that we wanted to get as much data as possible in as short time as possible. Today, I mean, we did get a broader representation of cognitive testing, but or abilities tested. Today, I probably would have preferred to have a bit longer and one test because of the retest. Because of the new effort that every time they switch test, they can kind of wake up a little bit.
Yeah.
But it has been suggested that to compensate for the short tests, one could lower, instead of having small lapses on 500, you would reduce the small lapses to 355, which would make them as sensitive to to fatigue as a 10-minute test.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But the problem was that if I would have done this, more than 50% of the simple reaction time tests or would have been over this part.
Yeah.
And digivigilance would all have been over. None was below 355, which probably says us quite much in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is still not really solved, how you decide on the length. But what about the reluctance that you saw in registering high sleepiness scores? What do you think of that?
Yeah. I think it's a little bit to do with the culture. It seemed, I got the impression that they did not think it was very male-y or masculine to report high scores. And it was also because of the fishermen that I changed into the physical fatigue score, which is a scale that we did ourselves, so that one has not been validated, apart from it follows quite well the sleepiness scale. But many fishers said that they couldn't identify with that one. Some said even that he never wanted to report his sleepiness score until 2 hours after waking up, because otherwise he would have to put a 9. And he didn't want to put a 9. No. So it kind of, they don't like to put high scores, so even though the scores are reasonably high, it's probably lower than the actual score.
Yeah, so you know that you haven't got the best case.
No, but I mean, probably not all of them were as him, but I did observe reluctant to high scores. But one thing that is also, ideally you're supposed to wait 5-10 minutes before scoring.
Oh, yeah.
And they did not have the opportunity to do that. So I could see sometimes when they just got off the shift and went into the mess room to eat, they would score 2 or something, 3, and say they were feeling really well. And then 5-10 minutes after, they would sleep. So that is also a problem.
Yeah, but I could see that, because you said, I think you said you noticed someone falling asleep on the bridge, or maybe somebody told you about it.
No, it was when I was actually studying the actigraphs, the data from the watches, actigraph watches. I could see that because I did the captain and the officer right after each other, and I said, oh, didn't he? So I remembered what had been in the other one, so I went back to compare, because I saw the other one had been sleeping, and I thought the other one was also, and it showed that both had been sleeping at the same time. So it does happen. It probably happened more than once, but in this particular situation, I saw it. And
you noticed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
But I know it's not something that is particular with this research. You found the same in the Marta project and many others as well. Yeah. They're in the Marta project. Yeah. Yeah.
There was a change during your work in the work hour legislation. There was a change in the working hour legislation
Yeah.
recently or during the time of your work. Did that have any effect on
No,
you?
actually, the change happened after I finished my data collection. So it didn't affect my data, but I don't know how the changes have been. But that would mean that those who were working, on the most severely tired people, sleepy people. They would have to change their shift to fit into that new category.
So there's definitely room for a follow-up study.
Yeah, there is.
Imagine now that you are a professor and you've got this student who says, I want to repeat your study because it was so good, Miss Professor. What would you advise them to do differently or the same?
Well, first I would advise them to have a control group. And I would we used, for example, for the noise measurements, we used a single device that we measured in different locations of the ship. So ideally, if I would repeat it, I would give them dosimeters, because then you could actually log the times of the noise meters together with other variables, because it has a clock on, and that would be more accurate. And there are quite a few errors that I wouldn't repeat, or that I would a few things I would like to improve.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a better project than my own.
You don't have to tell us about all the other errors.
No. So
how, if I gave you a bag of money tomorrow, what study would you do? The first one. I think I would like to study the same crew 3, 4, 5 times with different shift systems to see, to test which one were the best, because we run the analysis on shift system itself, we couldn't see any effect, even though we can see comparing vessel groups. So I think that, and then I would improve all the measures that I didn't do last time, and probably shorten down my questionnaires. And, less data.
Yeah, less data, but very precise what I wanted to get out of it.
Good. I've got one last question.
Yeah.
When you're finished, how would you like other academics to refer to you in one sentence?
I think just as myself, but you're thinking about a title?
Yeah, no, would they say, oh, it's that woman who did the fishery fatigue studies, or it's the expert on sleep, or it's...
Well, I'm not an expert on sleep, so I would say the fisher fatigue study, yeah.
Okay, thank you, and I hope you get to be talked about like that.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Hello? Yeah. Now the assessment committee will have a short meeting, and you just stay still, and we'll come back within 5 minutes we just go in and vote and find out our final verdict. I will now read up the final recommendation from the evaluation committee. The Ph.D. candidate Annbjørg Abrahamsen has, by her dissertation, Fatigue, Sleepiness and Sleep among Faroese Fishers, demonstrated knowledge of and the ability to conduct research of high standard. By public defense, she demonstrated her ability to discuss and reflect on the points raised by the evaluator in a fully satisfactory manner. The members of the evaluation committee find that Annbjørg Abrahamsen, by her dissertation and public defense, has documented the ability to carry out a research project by independent application of scientific theories and methods, and in a way, her work has contributed to advancing research at levels meeting international standard. So in conclusion, we find the dissertation and the public defense to be of high academic standard and recommend that Annbjørg Abrahamsen is awarded the Ph.D. Congratulations.